Chapter 101. With neither grief nor joy, white cloth brings calamity to this world. Shilian couldn't tell if he was awake or asleep. If he was awake, then he was reacting to nothing in the outside world and no memory of anything. If he was asleep, his eyes had been open the whole time. By the time he came back to himself, White No-Face had strapped the black sword to his waist like an elder giving a reward to a child. "This is my gift to you." He patted the hilt. His voice was gentle and thick with a deeper meaning. "It will certainly prove much sharper than any of the others you collected, even the ones from Junwu." Shilian let him hang the sword as he willed, neither speaking nor retaliating. Retaliation would be pointless. He put a new set of robes in the He put on a new set of robes in that state. Armed with new sword, he dragged himself outside in what felt like a newly born body. He walked out of the temple of the Crown Prince towards the darkness. White No-Face called for him. "Wait." Shilian paused in his step. White No-Face soundlessly came to his side and placed a white silk band in his hand. "You forgot this." It was the white silk band he had once used to cover his face, the one that had also been used to bind him. Shilian wobbled down the mountain alone. Day had already broken, the sun had come out, but Shilian didn't feel warm at all when it shined on him. On his way down the mountain, he saw a little trickling steam, clear and lively. He approached the stream's banks. The water reflected his appearance. Shilian stared at his pale face. The face was smooth and fair without a single cut to be seen. The neck was the same, which meant the chest and abdomen and other places were all healed. He only looked for a while before he couldn't bear the sight any longer. Lowering his head, he cupped some stream water in his hands and washed his face to drink a few mouthfuls. He drank and drank until he happened to notice something nearby. Slowly he looked up. Not far upstream there was a corpse lying on the shore, slumped next to a giant boulder. Judging by the clothes, it was a corpse of a buff street performer. The man hadn't descended the mountain. He died on the road. There was a particularly obvious bloodstream on the giant boulder. Whether from pain or fear, it looked like he had smashed himself against it until he died. The corpse was already rotten and emitting a foul stench. Half of the body was soaking in the water of the stream. Although the body didn't move, the little deformed faces growing on its half-rotten face were still squirming. Shilian knelt in the stream and puked his guts for over an hour, heaving until blood came up. After descending the mountain, he walked through the city for a long time, aimlessly wandering the main streets without destination in mind. Suddenly, a hand gripped his shoulder and yanked him into an alley. Shilian looked around and saw an incoming fist before he even glimpsed into the other's face. "Where did you run off to for so long?" Behind the fist was Fang Shen's furious expression. But by the time Shilian saw, he had already been knocked onto the ground by the punch. Fang Shen hadn't expected to knock him down so easily. Confused, he looked at his own fist, then Shilian on the ground. Before he could think to help him up, Shilian had already crawled back up by himself. Fang Shen's face changed, but in the end, his temper was still flaring. "You've got such an attitude, dropping only a word before running away and disappearing for 2 months. Do you know how worried their majesties have been?" Shilian wiped away the splattered blood on his face from his nosebleed. "I'm sorry." Seeing that he was making things worse by wiping, Fang Shen heaved a heavy sigh. "Your Highness, forget it. Forget it with the apology. There's no need between us. But what happened to you? Why were you gone for so long? Can't you tell me?" He noticed the black sword hanging on Shilian's waist. "And where did you get that sword?" Shilian wanted to tell him, but then he remembered the arrangement he had with Fang Shen before he left, and the doubtful expression on Fang Shen's face. Then he remembered the argument he had with Fang Shen before he left, and the doubtful expression on Fang Shen's face, and that brought to mind the experience he never wanted to think about again. So he just repeated, "I'm sorry." The two returned to the hideout, and when the queen saw Shilian, she hugged him and wept. The king looked like he'd aged quite a bit again. Before, it was the matter of finding white hair among the black, but now it was a search for black amongst all the white. Whenever he wasn't blowing his top for some reason, and he only spoke a few words before falling silent. The three of them were probably afraid that Shilian would run away for another 2 months if he was provoked again, so they were very careful with their words and gestured around him. Fengshen. After a meal so simple it was crude. Shilian untied the black sword at his waist and passed it over. "Take this sword. Pawn it." Fengshen noticed that the hand holding the sword was shaking, but he couldn't guess what was causing it. "Why?" "Didn't you ask for money before?" Shilian said. A flash of hurt suddenly crossed Fengshen's face, and he shook his head after. "I don't need it anymore." Shilian didn't speak another word. He tossed the black sword on the side and stopped caring about it. Then he flopped over and fell asleep. When Shilian came back this time, he tried to act like nothing had happened in the hope that everything would return to normal as soon as possible, in the hope that he could return to the person he once was. Soon he and Fengshen went to perform in the street. Fengshen was still worried at first and told him, "Forget it. Just rest for a couple more days." "I've already rested for almost 2 months," Shilian said. "If those street performers keep coming to cause trouble, it'll be easier to handle it with 2 people. They stopped coming a while ago," Fengshen explained. It wasn't because the buff street performer had died and there was no one to lead, but because Fengshen had been settled here for a while now. When he first arrived, everyone had regarded him as a novelty, but the novelty had worn away in the passage of time, and the watching of him was now no different than watching the other local buskers. Fengshen had lost his competitive edge, and the other street performers stopped looking for trouble now, and he wasn't a threat. Since everyone made about the same amount of money, it was fine. But now, no matter how hard Fengshen shot his arrows, no matter how expert his skill, the audience and the reward they paid for his efforts was less than half of what it once was. In fact, way less than 10%. After working over half the day, Fengshen was exhausted and sweating profusely and sat down on the roadside. "Let me go up," Shilian said. "Nah, don't worry about it," Fengshen replied. However, Shilian didn't bother listening to him. The passerby became interested again in the sight of a new face. "And what special skills do you have, lad?" Shilian didn't respond. He picked up a branch and started to perform a swordplay routine. Though he wielded a mere branch, the techniques were beautifully performed, and the sound of the wind being cut carried the sharpness of the sword's intent. A few audience members did him the honor and cheered. Fengshen looked up from one side, his expression complicated. He only watched for a bit before he turned to gaze away. Shilian didn't feel shame at all, nor did he feel any burden. He just kept deliberately and gracefully swinging his branch. Suddenly, someone in the crowd began to jeer. "It's so boring. What a pathetic act. Who wants to watch you fucking poke around blindly with a tree branch?" Fengshen immediately jumped to his feet and shouted, "You watch your language!" Shilian faltered to look over. There was a man in the crowd who was munching on a melon and spitting out the seeds. He was obviously there to watch a show. "This ancestor's here to watch a street performance. I'll say what I want to say. You're here to earn a small reward. So why do you care what I say?" the man yelled back at Fengshen. "Switch to a real sword. Use a real one, and Granddaddy will consider granting you some seeds." As soon as he started yelling, others in the audience followed suit. Fengshen was furious and just about to strike out when a white shadow flashed past. Shilian was already standing next to the heckler. He grabbed the man and threw him high in the air. The strength he exhibited was incredible, and the heckler's melon rinds trembled to the ground, and he was thrown meters away. The crowd was left to gape in open-mouthed shock. The man landed with a heavy thud, bleeding from his orifices and screaming horribly. However, Shilian wasn't done. He went over to seize the man once again, his voice flat and emotionless. "There are no real swords here, but it can really take your life. Do you want to see that act?" The audience broke away and fled in terror. "Somebody, help! Murderer!" Fengshen was even more shocked. "Your Highness!" Shilian ignored him and prepared to throw the heckler another several meters away, and let him fall wherever. But Fengshen hurried over and held Shilian down, even forgetting to hide his identity as he roared, "Your Highness, snap out of it! You're going to kill him!" Shilian's eyes were burning with black flames. He smacked Feng Shen's hand away and pressed the man to the ground. The heckler passed out cold. Feng Shen bent down and was just about to check whether he was breathing when he heard someone yelling sharply at the end of the street. "It's them! Over there!" Oh no. The Yong'an soldiers had come. Feng Shen bolted instantly, but Shilian stood there staring at the Yong'an soldiers like he was contemplating starting a fight with them. Feng Shen turned around and pulled him away. "What are you standing there for? Run!" The two of them ducked and hid under cover until they could make an escape and return to the little safe house. The moment they passed through the door, Feng Shen started yelling right in front of the queen. "Why would you do something like that?" Once Feng Shen would have never dared to be so unruly before the two majesties, but a lot had changed. They had all been ground down for so long. Shilian turned to the queen. "Go to your room." My son, what?" The queen started. "Go to your room," Shilian shouted. The queen didn't dare press further and returned to her room. Shilian turned to Feng Shen. "What do I do?" "You were going to kill that man," Feng Shen said angrily. "He didn't die," Shilian countered. "And so what if he did?" Feng Shen was dumbfounded. "What did you say? What do you mean, so what if he died?" "That filthy peasant was asking for it," Shilian said. "And since he asked for it, I gave it to him. Was I wrong?" Stunned by Shilian's new vocabulary, it was a good moment before Feng Shen said, "He was causing trouble, but you didn't need to kill him. Smack around and let it go. He didn't deserve to die over some petty words." Shilian cut him off. "Of course he did. He dared to say it, so he had to pay the price." "How can you say something like that?" Feng Shen asked, voice thick with disbelief. "Like what?" Shilian asked. "I've never heard you call someone a peasant like that before," Feng Shen said. "What are you trying to say?" Shilian said. "It's not like I'm a god. Can't I be angry? Can't I hate?" Feng Shen didn't know how to respond. A moment later, he arousedly squeezed out a few words. "That's not what I meant, but still, you didn't need to." Shilian didn't want to listen anymore and stopped talking to him. He stomped to his own room and slammed the door. The moment the door was shut, he screamed and threw himself to the bed. He was fooling himself, utterly fooling himself. No matter what, it was impossible to pretend nothing had happened. It was impossible for him to return to who he once was. That evening, someone knocked on the door. Shilian assumed it was Feng Shen, so he ignored it. The queen's voice sounded from the other side a moment later. "My son, it's your mother. Let your mother come in and take a look at you, all right?" Shilian had just wanted to lie there without moving, but after staying there for another moment, he still got up and opened the door. "What?" he asked tiredly. The queen stood at the door holding a plate. "My son, you haven't eaten yet, have you?" Shilian stared at her and endured the urge to speak for a long time before he finally swallowed the words that were already rolling up his throat. "Even though I haven't eaten, I don't want to eat anything you made." He moved aside to allow his mother to look in the room, and the queen placed the plate on the table. "Look." Shilian looked and got so angry he got so angry he wanted to laugh. "What is that?" The queen spoke as if she was offering him treasures. "It's the lovebirds upon a branch meatballs and the blooming flowers and full moon stew." The lovebirds looked like they were dead, and the full moon was full of craters. Shilian had to interrupt her. "Why did you name these things?" "Don't dishes always have names?" the queen said. "That's for imperial dining in a palace," Shilian said. "Ordinarily, people don't give dishes names." Imperial dining, palace, ordinary people. The queen remained quiet for a while, then smiled. "Well, no one ever said you have to dine imperially to give a dish a name. So just take this as a wish for good fortune. Come, try some. Mother spent a long time making this for you." And then she passed a pair of chopsticks over. Shilian didn't smile, nor did he touch the chopsticks. The queen sat there smiling for a while before her face gradually fell. "My son." Shilian's tone was brusque. "What?" "Why are you fighting with Feng Shen again?" the queen asked. Shilian didn't want to explain it. He didn't have the energy to do so regardless. "You two just stay in your room and relax. You don't need to worry about any of these things." The queen hesitated for a moment. "Mother knows she probably shouldn't say this, but that child Feng Shen, was the only one who looked after us during many days you were gone." "Mother, what are you trying to say?" he demanded. "My son, don't be angry. I'm not trying to blame you," the queen said quickly. "I'm really not. I know you have difficult time as well. I'm not saying that young Fengshen has always followed us. I'm only saying that young Fengshen has always followed us, followed you, and it isn't easy for him. I can sense that he's stayed with us until now, not because he didn't want to leave, but because he still cares about your friendship." Shilian leapt to his feet. Who has had it easy? Has it been easy for me? Mother, can you please stop asking questions? Can you please not involve yourself in things that you don't understand? When she saw that he was running out the door, the queen started panicking and got up to chase after him. "My son, where are you going? I'll stop talking. Mother won't say anything. Come back." "I know," Shilian exclaimed sharply. "Everyone's having a hard time, but don't worry. I'll go right now and make things easy for everyone." The queen couldn't keep up with him, and wasn't long before she was left behind. Shilian returned later that night, carrying a few sacks. When he opened the door, no one had gone to bed. They were all waiting for him, their expressions sullen. Shilian shut the door with a backhand push. "What's up?" It seemed that the king had already lectured the queen, and the rims of her eyes were red. When she saw Shilian had returned, she let out a long sigh of relief and forced a happy smile. "My son, you've come back. I won't ask you any unnecessary questions from now on. Just don't leave us so suddenly. Mother will definitely listen to you if there's anything." Everyone was scared. Scared that if he turned around and left again, he'd be missing for another 2 months. "You all think too much," Shilian said. "I wasn't going to leave. Just go and rest." Fengshen waited until the king and queen had gone to their room. After a moment of silence, he began to speak. "Even if I ask where you went, you wouldn't tell me, right?" Shilian didn't reply, just tossed the sacks to the ground. They made a crisp, clanking sound as they landed. "What's this?" Fengshen asked. Shilian opened the sacks and dumped them out. From within tumbled a large pile of shining gold, silver, and silver wares that nearly brightened the entire house. Fengshen instantly stood up. Where did these come from?" Shilian didn't bother to look up as he replied. He just sat on the ground and counted the haul. "There's no need to be like that. I paid a visit to a big household in the city. Relax. No one saw me." Fengshen's eyes were round and bulging. "You!" Remembering just then the king and queen were in the next room, he lowered his voice. "You stole them?" "You don't need to look at me like that," Shilian said. "Everyone's having a hard time. This will make things easier." "You still shouldn't have stolen them," Fengshen exclaimed. "We can just busk." "And how much did we earn from killing ourselves performing on the streets?" Shilian said. Fengshen staggered back a couple of steps. It was the first time Shilian had looked at him like he was about to faint. He finally steadied himself and took a moment to make sure he hadn't heard wrong. Then he mumbled, "What made you this way?" Shilian looked up. "What way?" Fengshen was furious. "I don't want to lecture you, but just look at yourself, at what you've become. I've already stopped asking about the robbery, so how did things get even worse?" Shilian snorted. "I knew it." "Knew what?" Fengshen asked. Shilian rose to his feet. "I knew that robbery thing was still in your mind. You wanted to ask me, but you didn't have the heart. You've thought about it 1,000 times, right? Don't obsess about it anymore. I'll tell you." Step by step, he closed in on Fengshen. "It's true. I robbed someone." Fengshen was forced back a step. "You." Then he advanced a step and hissed it with anger. "We've been passing our days in such hardship, and for what? If you were willing to do such things, then we could have done them already. Why suffer until today? What are you doing? Throwing away all your efforts. Are you still the same royal highness I used to know?" "You're right. What have we suffered until today?" Shilian said. Fengshen was taken aback, and Shilian continued. "What was I like in the past? I didn't talk back when I was cursed at. Didn't fight back when I was beaten. And I always overestimated myself. I was so determined to save the common people. What kind of person does all that? A dumbass? Do you think being a dumbass is better? Do you think that that's the kind of person I should be? Are you going to be shocked if I'm not?" Fengshen was stunned. Are you crazy? Why do you have to say it like that?" "You're wrong. I'm not crazy," Shilian said. "I've just suddenly come to my senses. Now I know that the past me was the crazy one. Why are you being like this? When did you become this way? Fengshen mumbled. I really don't know. Why did I follow you all this time? Then stop following me, Shilian said. Fengshen couldn't wrap his head around it. What? I said don't follow me anymore, Shilian repeated. Then he slammed the door. 4 hours later, there was finally some wrestling outside the room and low voices speaking. It seemed Fengshen was bidding farewell to Shilian's mother and father. Fengshen's voice was extremely low, and the queen's voice was choked with sobs. The king didn't say much, but there was a lot of coughing. The door opened a moment later, then closed. Fengshen's voice vanished, and the sound of his footsteps grew more and more distant. Fengshen had left. Shilian was still shut in his room, emotionless, expressionless. A moment later, he closed his eyes. He'd finally left. Ever since Muching left them, Shilian had been terrified of this possibility, that one day Fengshen would leave too. But he'd become so scared of it that he could no longer endure the torment. Rather than dragging it out, slowly grinding away all the kindness and friendship, and like sharpening a knife until nothing remained, until they loathed the sight of each other, it was better to make it explode now. Before Fengshen left, Shilian had been afraid. Now that Fengshen was gone, he wasn't scared anymore. But even though he no longer felt fear, he felt a deeper agony. Shilian had initially been held a 1 in a million bit of hope at the bottom of his heart. He'd hoped that Fengshen would stay, even if Shilian admitted that he had done things he shouldn't have, even if he had become the worst version of himself. After all, those two had never left each other's sides since he turned 14 and Fengshen was selected to be his personal attendant. They were master and servant, but more than that, they were friends. And Fengshen had no one to care for aside from the crown prince either, or at most, him and the king and queen. But Fengshen had already left. Shilian had already guessed it would end like this, and he could understand it completely. He just couldn't bear it for the moment. Just then, the queen's voice came from outside his silent room. My son, I'm so sorry. Shilian couldn't immediately think of a response. He crawled out of his bed and opened the door and went out. It's nothing. It's got nothing to do with you, he said tiredly. The king and queen were both sitting at the old creaky table. Father and mother dragged you down and made you do things for our sake. We even made you and Fengshen argue, the queen said. Shilian forced a smile. What bad things? Aren't tales and legends full of stories about stealing from rich and helping the poor? Since Fengshen's gone, he's gone. This is good, actually. With him gone, things will be more relaxed. Relaxed on both sides. You two just focus on healing. Tomorrow we can buy the best medicine. However, the queen glared at him. I won't use that money. The queen tugged at him covertly. Then what do you want? Shilian demanded. The king coughed out a few more times. You, go chase after Fengshen and bring him back. I don't want this money. Although the queen was still tugging at him, she agreed. Yes, why don't you chase after Fengshen? He's your most loyal servant and your best friend. Most loyal servant is no more, Shilian said. We have money, so just use it. Don't ask about anything else. I already told you. You don't understand these things. After a long silence, the queen said, I'm so sorry, my son. Mom and Dad can see that you've been struggling very hard on your own. But we're only mortals, so we can't help you at all. And you have to take care of us on top of everything else. Shilian was out of energy to say more, so he placated them with empty words of comfort before sending them back to their room. To try to clear his mind, Shilian unwrapped his white silk band and stripped off all his clothes, then took a quick bath before passing out in bed. He slept so deeply that when he woke up the next day, he wondered bitterly, how come Fengshen didn't wake me? It took some time before he remembered that Fengshen had left. Shilian flipped over and sat up, falling into a daze. But there was something else. Even if Fengshen had left, what about his parents? Why didn't his father and mother come to rouse him either? Normally, he would have heard the king coughing by now. That sound had never eased. So why was it so quiet today? Shilian suddenly felt uneasy. He put on his clothes and got out of bed, then reached for his silk band. but it was missing. He pushed open the door to the room next to his. "Mother, have you seen my—" The moment he opened the door, his pupils instantly shrank to 2 minuscule dots. He had found his silk-white band. The silk band had been hanging from a beam. 2 unmoving figures dangled from it. Their bodies had long since gone stiff. They were the bodies of his father and mother. Shilian wondered if perhaps he was still dreaming. He staggered, reaching out to support himself on the wall, but he was swaying so badly that he couldn't catch himself and slipped down along the wall instead. He sat on the ground, hands covering his face. He couldn't breathe. He choked on air. He cried and laughed and cried. I. He rambled incoherently to no one. Then he added, "It wasn't... No. Wait, you can't... In the end, he couldn't even form a complete sentence. He turned around and screamed, smashing his head against the wall over and over. He should have known. His father was such a conservative, traditional king, and his mother couldn't bear the sight of her loved ones suffering, let alone suffering for her sake. They were both nobility, raised in prestige. It was already a miracle that they'd hung on for so long. Shilian smacked his head against the wall hundreds of times. "Fengshen, my father and mother are gone," he mumbled. No one was listening. Only then did he realize he needed to get his parents' corpses down. After he lowered them, Shilian acted like he had nothing left to do and walked around the house. He saw that there was a few plates of horrid-looking food on the table, long gone cold. They were the dishes that Shilian had made the queen take away the night before without eating a single bite. Now he pulled them over absent-mindedly and ate everything, not daring to leave behind a single leaf, afraid to miss a single grain of rice. After he ate, he heaved and began to vomit. Suddenly, Shilian grabbed the white silk band and threw it over the beam, then put his own neck through its knotted loop. Waves of suffocation assaulted him, yet his mind remained clear. Even when his eyes filled with blood, even when his collarbones cracked, he still remained conscious. As he hung there, the white silk band abruptly loosened on its own. Shilian fell heavily to the ground. In the midst of his dizziness, he saw that the white silk band had actually started moving by itself with no breeze to aid it. It was coiling like a venomous snake. It had conceived its own spirit. It had been dyed with Shilian's blood and hung 2 royals to death. If Shilian could die, then it would have been 3. Saturated with such deep resentment and evil, it would be stranger if it didn't turn into a spirit. The little spirit had only just arrived in this world and didn't understand at all that it had been born from such despair. It happily drifted over to the one who had given it a soul, like it was hoping for a gesture of affection. However, Shilian had no eyes for it, and he clutched his head and roared. Illustration. Somebody come kill me. He could only pray that somebody would come right that second to take his life and help him break free from the endless pain and torture. Just then, in a far distance, he heard the roaring sounds of gongs and drums. Shilian panted harshly, his eyes bloodshot. What is that? He wondered. Something drove him to his feet, and he stumbled outside to look. He walked for a long time before he finally realized that it was the sound of the celebration. They were commemorating the imperial palace's construction in a newly established royal capital of the new established kingdom of Yong'an. The entire nation had joined in jubilation. All the former citizens of Shinla were now cheering for Yong'an. On the main street, everyone's faces bore bright smiles. It was such a familiar sight. Shilian remembered now. This was how people of Shilian's imperial capital had cheered during the Shongyan heavenly ceremonial procession. Shilian staggered back to the cottage and sat listlessly on the floor. Why did he have to witness the laughter and cheers of the Yong'an people when the corpses of the king and queen of Shinla lay at his feet? Shilian buried his face in his hands, crying and laughing. A moment later, he giggled. Don't think it'll be that easy for you. Memories flashed in his mind of a voice telling him, human face disease is resentment. That's how you create human face disease. A savage light glinted in his eyes and his voice softened. I won't let any of you off so easily. The expression of his face was like he was both crying and laughing, like joy and sadness mixed together. Using the wall as support, he slowly rose to his feet. Yong'an, forever peace? Dream on. Keep dreaming forever. I curse all of you. I curse all of you. I want all of you to die. All of you. To the last. Shilian laughed and rushed forth like a whirlwind. When he passed the mirror, he suddenly paused and whipped his head around. His reflection had already changed completely. He wasn't wearing his white cultivator robes, which were threadbare from the wash. Instead, he was wearing a snow-white funeral robes with expansive sleeves. His face was no longer his own, but a half-crying, half-smiling mask. Shilian would have once screamed in horror at the sight of himself like this. However, Shilian of today wasn't scared at all. He laughed maniacally and ignored the change. He stumbled to the door, crashing through it before breaking into a dash. The former imperial capital of Shinla was now nothing more than a field of ruined wreckage. There were still some who lived near the wreckage, residents who had been lucky enough to survive the and refugees who had nowhere else to go. Ever since the plague of human face disease had erupted and the imperial city had fallen, the once glamorous capital was subject to frequent sinister, chilling winds. Today they seemed especially cold. The few disheveled beggars who had remained were fleeing, watching the skies as they ran. They sensed that something ominous was approaching and knew better than to linger in the streets. The battlefields sprawled in front of the broken imperial city gates. Not many dared visit it. Now there was only an old cultivator scurrying around trying to catch some lost, wandering souls. He stuffed them into his sack once they were caught, ready to take them and tie them into lanterns. He darted around. The old cultivator unexpectedly discovered that a strange white-clothed figure had appeared at the edge of the battlefield. Truly strange, truly particular. The man was wearing white funeral robes with expansive sleeves, and he had a band of white silk tied to one arm. The white silk band flowed in the wind like it was alive. On the man's face was a ghastly white mask, half of it crying, half of it smiling. The old cultivator shuddered violently, and before he knew why he was fleeing, his legs had already carried him away from the battlefield. He stopped before the fright had left him completely and looked back. The white-clothed man didn't speak a single word as he strolled across the battlefield. Chilling wind whipped around him, and with every step he trampled bones of those who had died in the war. Countless souls of the dead were struggling and wailing on this soil, even after the air was black from resentment. Do you hate? The white-clothed man asked coldly. The dead souls wailed and cried. The white-clothed man took another few steps. The people you swore to protect, the people for whom you swore to die, they have now become the people of a new kingdom. Do you hate? The wails of the dead souls now had shrieking mixed in. They've forgotten those who have died on battlefield, forgotten your sacrifices. They're cheering for the ones who stole your lives away. The white-clothed man said slowly, Do you hate? Amidst the shrieking, there came howling and snarling. The white-clothed man called out sharply, What's the use in screaming? Answer me. Do you hate? The battlefield's air began to echo with innumerable voices of resentment and agony. I hate, kill, I want to kill them. The white-clothed man opened his arms towards them and expanded both hands. Come to my side. He then made his vow, saying the words slowly and clearly. I promise the people of Yong'an shall never know peace. The shrieking and howling, the snarling, it shook the ground and crashed the heavens. The souls of the dead had answered him. Fallen Shinla soldiers mingled with those who had died from human face disease, and in that sky choked by black mist, they took shape. The old cultivator witnessed the whole thing from afar in terror. This is... In an instant, only 3 words appeared in his mind. White-clothed calamity. Suddenly, the white-clothed man heard the young man's voice. Your Highness. He looked back, only to find that a black-clad man was already standing there, and then the young man bowed his head and bent one knee to the ground. And that is the end of chapter 101.